Well, the problem Nehemiah encounters in the last part of chapter 13 has to do with the passing on the faith to the next generation. And his heart is burdened for this. And it actually may be the thing that makes him the angriest of all. So we read this in verse 23. It says, "In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab." Pause. Some of you may remember this was the same problem found in Ezra 10. And I am not sure who assigned me both of these passages, but here it is again. You may remember that Ezra had a rather problematic response to the issue of intermarriage. Nehemiah also has a problem with this, and it's the problem of what I'll call spiritual intermarriage, because essentially what's happened is the Jewish people, the people of God, were marrying foreign people who had not converted to worship Yahweh God, and this was a big deal. I can't emphasize that enough, because now false worship, Tobiah literally, is coming into the home, the place where families are formed. So let me illustrate this to give you an idea of why it was such a big problem. Some of you in the audience are married, okay? Others, you were married. Some of you, you're going to be married someday. And I'm just going to tell you, marriage changes you. The two become one flesh. Your spouse influences your thinking, the things you care about. You make decisions together. By God's grace, you raise kids together. You're not the same person now than you were before you got married. And if you marry somebody who's not a Christian, and even somebody who's a Christian but maybe is not walking with Jesus at the same pace as you, there's going to be some friction. Do you know why? Because there's going to be a pull to please your spouse over God. Paul writes about that. 1 Corinthians 7, 2 Corinthians 5. He addresses that. It's going to impact your spiritual life and how you raise kids. So when Nehemiah says that the Jews are marrying the Ashdodites and the Ammonites and the Moabites, he's angry because this is going to seriously compromise the passing on of the faith. Now, what's his proof? He goes on and he cites King Solomon, verse 26. It says, "Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin." Now, of course, the sin wasn't the fault of the women, because Solomon made the choice and allowed himself to be influenced. He chose to allow himself into a compromising situation. And then in 1 Kings, we get the firsthand report of what happened to Solomon. 1 Kings 11:4 says, "For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." Every time I read that, it's just such a sad verse. And you know, if you read the rest of 1 Kings, you know it didn't go well. But it's the crux of the matter. It's what's at stake. It's the idol of romance. And I can't tell you how many times I have had friends, I've watched students, or people I knew who grew up in the church, were walking with Jesus, seemed to be on fire for Jesus, and then they got to college, and they got into a relationship. They got into their 20s, their 30s, you know, get into your 40s or later, and you're dating somebody who's not a believer, and then you know what happens? They start questioning their faith. Interesting how that works out. Why? Because that relationship changes you, and it becomes more important to you than following Christ. It captures your heart. And whatever covenant promise you think you made by walking down an aisle or praying a prayer goes out the window on the altar of romance and what it promises. How many of us have been captured by romance? Beware. Your relationship with and commitment to Christ is the most important thing in life. Don't let dating take you away from him. And if you're married, it will not merely affect you, it will affect your kids. Look at verse 24. This is it. Verse 24. "And half of our children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people." Now look at that word language. That is crucially important, because we're told that the kids right here, they spoke a different language, a language that was not the people of God. Now remember, at the time, faith was still passed on orally. And the Hebrew scriptures, they were the language of Scripture. Hebrew was the language. That was the language of Judah. And so if the children did not speak Hebrew, they would never hear the story of the Scriptures. And their faith would either be lost or it would never materialize. And that's why it's such a big deal. The children would miss the message of Scripture. They would not learn about God and the deep things. And the heart of the family then would be torn apart because their hearts were not submitted to the same God. And now we circle back to the beginning. Why did Nehemiah turn into the Hulk? Well, it's in this context that we get to Nehemiah 13:25. He says, "And I confronted them, and I cursed them, and I beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, 'You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, or yourselves.'" Now, again, why would he get so angry? Because the faith of the people of God is in jeopardy. The kids are being harmed due to their selfishness. And he's saying, don't you see what you're doing? If I got to pull out your beard to wake you up and see how serious this is, I'll do it. Now, just to be clear, I'm not endorsing this action. In fact, I told John, where's John? I told John, your beard is safe. It's a beautiful beard, John. We're not pulling it out. Again, the Old Testament is descriptive, not prescriptive. If you start beating people, I'm just going to tell you, we're going to call the police, okay? And Nehemiah shouldn't have done it either. But I'm bringing it up. I want you to see the point is, do you see why he's so angry, why he's fired up about this? Because the people of God succumbed to the worship of idols. Their hearts were far from God. It was tearing apart their families, and it was affecting their children. And Nehemiah literally grabs the problem by the throat, the beard, and confronts them and says, stop it. Because if the children don't have the right language, it's a problem. Now, let me ask you, what language are you teaching your kids? Now, language, that is such an interesting topic nowadays. Oh, man, if I used bad language growing up, I would get some soap in my mouth. Anybody else? Yeah, that's how the 80s rolled. Not anymore. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is too often our young people, they are more adept at the language of popular culture rather than the Scriptures. How many Taylor Swift songs do you have memorized? And then compare that with how many Bible verses you have memorized. Because what you have memorized is what gets into your heart. That's why I love what we're doing at the Awana program right now here at NBC, trying to get the Scriptures in the heart. We want our kids to have the language of faith, because when it affects the next generation, that's when the temperature gets kicked up a notch, right? Gen Z and beyond. We've heard about a lot of parents rising up and voicing their opinions about the language their kids are exposed to, and that even goes beyond Christians. You know, this week I was listening to a report about education. Do you know in the last few years what type of schooling has had the largest growth? Homeschooling. Now, that's not a commentary on what you've chosen to do with your kids. There's a lot of factors at play. With that, I'm just pointing out that it's growing, and I think a major reason is the parents want a larger say in what their kids get taught. And if you're a Christian, the reality is, as a parent, you have the primary responsibility of forming your child in the Lord. And that goes way beyond Sunday school once a week. If you drop your kid off, that's great. We want to help, but the church is not primary. The family is primary. And so you have to ask yourself, am I imparting a biblical view of the world as it relates to technology and relationships and culture? Are you teaching your kids the language of the Scriptures? Because the family is called to pass on the faith to the next generation. And when our kids walk away from the faith, that should make us angry, and we want to do something about it. Why? Because we love them. So don't settle for the language of Ashdod. Our kids need the language of Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah.